As we crept inside the house, I could tell that almost everyone was asleep. Only my father was still awake. I could just about make out his shadowy profile as he sat on the ground near the fire, where only the glowing embers remained. "See you in the morning," whispered Tully as he attempted to creep away into the darkness. "Boys, come here a moment," my father said in a raised whisper. He was not going to let either of us get away quite so easily. "Where have you been?" he asked as we sat down beside him. At first, neither of us responded, until finally I muttered, "At the wharf, father." "What were you doing there?" he asked, continuing to interrogate us. "Looking at the ships," offered Tully. "One of the warships is being readied for a raid." "Is that so?" he replied. "Tully would like to go with them," I offered. "But not you?" he said, as if he were stating a fact. I did not reply. "A warrior does not always know when he is ready to be a warrior," he said softly. "Only Odin and Tyr know that. When the time for fighting arrives, you will both be ready. Now get some sleep. You have chores to do in the morning." Tully and I stood up and kissed my father. Then we scuttled off into the darkness of the central hall. "See you bright and early in the morning," I teased Tully, knowing that he hated to get up before the sun had risen in the sky. I took off my woolen tunic and lay down. It felt good to rest my head upon my down pillow. I pulled my woolen blanket up around me and closed my eyes. My grandmother was always the first one to get up. Each morning before sunrise, she made porridge and bread for the entire family. Shortly after she arose, my father and mother would join her by the hearth. Mother would add logs to the embers, and father would disappear into his forge. Within minutes, Uncle Sven, my mother's brother, would join my father, and the day's work would begin. The sound of the hammer hitting the anvil and the hiss of hot metal and fire were never far away. I lay in the semi-darkness listening to the early morning hustle and bustle. These were the sounds of my childhood. These were the memories that I would keep in my heart for the rest of my life. Suddenly my eyes began to water. I quickly pinched myself to stop the flow of tears. As the porridge simmered and the bread baked, mother, grandmother, and Aunt Kristen went to work in the small room behind the central hall. There was the room where sheep's wool was spun, woven on a loom, and sewn into warm clothes and blankets. Thread from flax was also woven into lighter linen garments that could be worn during the warmer months. In addition to looking after the chickens, my sister Kidda was being taught as an apprentice how to spin, weave, and sew in the same way that I was being taught how to be a blacksmith. My Aunt Kristen was perhaps one of the most skillful women in our town at using vegetable dyes from plants to color woolen and linen cloth before it was cut and sewn into garments. She explained to me once that the color blue was extracted from the woad plant. The color red was extracted from madder, and yellow was extracted from weld. We children were responsible for gathering these plants. Tully did not work as an apprentice like me. Instead, he worked on his Uncle Eric's farm on the edge of town. There he tended the flock of sheep that provided many of the townspeople with wool. He also cared for the herd of cattle that provided additional milk as well as meat. Although there was a lot of it, the grain and vegetables produced in the fields were needed to feed our growing population. Even the long grass was used on the thatched roofs of our houses, or to cover the interior earthen floors. Very often in the late part of autumn, the older cattle were killed and the meat was dried. This provided much needed food in the winter time. "Tully, Bjorn, Kidda, Arnstead, and Karl, it's time to get up," said Grandfather Alfie, as he shuffled toward us in the dim light. "Come on, you sleepyheads, we need more wood for the fire, and we need some eggs. Oh, and get a pitcher of goat's milk too," he ordered. I could just make out the younger children stretching and yawning. I could see that Tully was the last one to lift his head from his pillow. I heard him yawn loudly several times, and then down again. Moments later, Grandfather Alfie threw one of his leather shoes at him, and he fell backward out of his bed. "Come on, Tully, let's go and chop some wood," I suggested, all the while laughing at him. Tully grunted at me by way of a reply. Tully and I worked together at chopping up the larger pieces of wood that were stored in an enclosure at the side of our house. Fortunately, our homeland had many forests that provided us with wood for our ships and homes, as well as fuel for the fires in our hearths. Wood was one of the few things we had in abundance. While we chopped wood into logs, Tully and I discussed the journey that we would soon be taking across the great ocean to Iceland. You know, Bjorn, there are enormous sea monsters that can devour a man in one gulp. They dwell in the watery depths of the great ocean, he said quite seriously. I've heard stories about them, but I've never seen one, I replied calmly. Well, it's true, he continued. It is best to keep a spear by your side at all times, even when you are sleeping, Tully advised me. You don't want to be caught unarmed if one rises up unexpectedly out of the waves. I wasn't sure a spear would be much use against the creature that Tully had described, but I nodded in agreement. An hour must have passed when we heard the sound of our grandmother's voice calling us all into breakfast. She didn't have to call any of us twice. Tully sprinted toward the house, and I followed close behind him. We quickly washed our hands and faces in a bucket of fresh water that had been placed outside the entrance to our home. As we sat together around the hearth, Grandmother ladled porridge into wooden bowls, which she then handed to us. Mother gave each of us a wooden spoon. In addition to the hot porridge, there was fresh bread, cheese, boiled eggs, and dried herring laid out on a large wooden platter. A pitcher of warm goat's milk was placed beside the platter. Each day, Viking families came together to eat two meals, breakfast and dinner. One of the two, breakfast, was my favorite. At breakfast time, the older family members were less tired and therefore less grumpy, and the events of the day were still a mystery waiting to happen. I sat on the floor between Tully and Kidda and devoured the warm porridge. When I finished my bowl of porridge, I reached for some bread and cheese and then poured goat's milk into a wooden cup. Eat up, Bjorn, said my father, smiling at me. Today is the day we begin to make your sword.